St. Joseph, Minnesota is the type of town where folks don't bother to lock the front door. A 2-hour drive north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Here, the police chief doesn't even carry a gun. But now, everything is different.
This shouldn't happen anywhere. It's the type of, it shouldn't happen anywhere. All I could think of was who would take a child away from their parents? Like, I couldn't fathom it.
On the night of October 22nd, 1989, 3 boys were riding their bicycles down a dark rural road in St. Joseph, Minnesota, heading home after renting a movie from a nearby convenience store. They were less than 3 minutes from safety when a masked man stepped out of the darkness, holding a gun, and ordered the boys to lie face down on the ground. Moments later, he told 2 of them to run into the woods and not look back. The 3rd boy disappeared into the darkness with the masked man. For the next 27 years, his face would appear on missing person posters across America. More than 70,000 tips poured into the investigation. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, but despite decades of searching, investigators still had no answers. What nobody realized was that the real killer had already been questioned within days of the abduction. It wasn't until DNA from a surviving victim in an earlier attack exposed the man police had overlooked for nearly 3 decades. Just 9 months before the abduction of the 3 boys in St. Joseph, another violent attack had taken place nearby. On the night of January 13, 1989, 12-year-old Jared Shirel was walking home with his friend Corey in Cold Spring, Minnesota, a small town not far from St. Joseph. The 2 boys had spent the evening at a local restaurant called the Side Cafe before eventually splitting up and heading home separately. As Jared continued walking alone, a man driving a green car pulled up beside him and asked for directions. The man then stepped out of the vehicle, told Jared he had a gun and wasn't afraid to use it, and ordered the boy into the car. Jared obeyed. He climbed into the back seat and lay face down as instructed. The man told him to place a hat over his head so he couldn't see where they were going. As the car drove through the dark rural roads of central Minnesota, Jared could hear the sound of a police scanner coming from the front seat. He tried to keep track of their movements as the man drove for nearly 15 minutes. At one point, they crossed a set of railroad tracks, but eventually, Jared lost all sense of direction. The car finally stopped on a remote gravel road. The man climbed into the back seat and attacked Jared. Afterwards, he drove the boy back toward town and dropped him off only a few minutes away from his home. Before letting him go, the man gave Jared a chilling warning. "Run as fast as you can and don't look back or you'll be shot." He then added one final threat. If anyone ever discovered who he was, he would find Jared and kill him. Terrified, Jared ran toward the nearest neighborhood and managed to get help from nearby residents before being taken to the Cold Spring Police Department later that night. Investigators immediately realized the seriousness of the attack and spent hours interviewing the 12-year-old boy, documenting every detail he could remember. Jared described his attacker as a brown-haired man in his 30s driving a green Chevrolet. He also told investigators that throughout the abduction, he could hear a police scanner coming from the front of the vehicle, a detail that immediately stood out to law enforcement because police scanners were not commonly owned by ordinary civilians at the time. Investigators collected every piece of clothing Jared had been wearing that night, including his winter jacket, t-shirt, and sweatshirt, preserving them as forensic evidence. Detectives believed the attacker may have left behind tiny biological traces during the struggle. Based on Jared's account, forensic artists created a composite sketch of the suspect, which was distributed throughout central Minnesota. Hundreds of tips poured into the investigation. Numerous men were questioned, investigated, or briefly considered suspects. Several early leads convinced investigators they were getting close to identifying the attacker, but one by one, those leads collapsed. There was no confession, no additional eyewitnesses, and no forensic evidence strong enough to charge anyone with the crime. Eventually, the investigation into Jared Shirel's abduction went cold. The physical evidence was sealed away in police storage, while the memory of the armed man and the sound of the police scanner remained buried in the mind of a terrified 12-year-old boy. But Jared was not the only teenager who had described a man like this. Between 1986 and 1987, several attacks targeting teenage boys had already been reported across central Minnesota. Some victims were approached while walking or riding their bicycles alone at night. Others were forced into vehicles and released hours later. Investigators slowly began to suspect the attacks could be connected to the same predator moving between small rural towns. But most of the cases remained isolated within separate local law enforcement agencies, and no large-scale public warnings were ever issued to nearby communities. For many families living in towns like St. Joseph, the danger still felt distant, something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. Because in the late 1980s, St. Joseph was still the kind of town where people believed children could ride their bikes home after dark without fear. And perhaps it was that sense of trust and security that made what happened on the night of October 22nd, 1989 feel so devastating. The boy taken that night was 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, the second son of Patty and Jerry Wetterling. Jacob grew up alongside his siblings, Amy, Trevor, and Carmen, on a quiet dead-end road surrounded by cornfields, brush, and long stretches of open land separating neighboring homes. Jacob was a sixth grader, known for his gentle personality and kind nature. He loved the ordinary parts of growing up in Minnesota: hockey, basketball, and especially soccer. October 22nd, 1989 began like any normal Sunday. Earlier that morning, Jacob and his father, Jerry, had gone fishing together, one of Jacob's favorite activities. They returned home in time to watch the Minnesota Vikings play the Detroit Lions on television. Later that afternoon, the family went ice skating together. It was a day filled with the simple things Jacob loved most, offering no sign of the tragedy that was about to unfold. That evening, Patty and Jerry left home to have dinner with friends about 25 miles away. Since they weren't planning to stay out late, and because there was no school the next day, they felt comfortable leaving the older children at home alone. Amy, the oldest sibling, was spending the night at a friend's house. That left 8-year-old Carmen, 10-year-old Trevor, and 11-year-old Jacob at home together. Jacob's friend, 11-year-old Aaron Ittle, was also staying over that night. While the three boys were eating pizza that evening, they decided they wanted to rent a movie from the nearby Tom Thumb convenience store, about 15 minutes away by bicycle. They called their mother to ask for permission to go. Patty's answer came quickly and firmly: absolutely not. Unwilling to accept the decision, Trevor asked to speak with his father instead, hoping for a different answer. Jerry listened to the boys and eventually agreed to let them go, but only if they followed a few safety rules. They had to bring a flashlight and wear reflective clothing so passing drivers would be able to see them in the dark. It was a small decision made by a father who simply wanted his children to enjoy a little independence. Once Jerry gave his permission, the boys excitedly began getting ready to leave. But there was still one problem. If all three of them left the house, who would stay behind with Carmen? Not wanting to leave their 8-year-old sister home alone, the boys contacted a 14-year-old neighbor named Rochelle and asked if she could watch Carmen while they were gone. She agreed. Jacob gathered the things they would need for the ride, including the flashlight and the reflective jacket his father had previously bought for him. Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron then climbed onto their bicycles and headed toward the Tom Thumb store. As they rode through the quiet, rural roads, the boys occasionally heard rustling sounds coming from the nearby cornfields and tall grass along the roadside. None of them thought much about it. They assumed it was probably just the wind or a small animal moving through the fields, and they continued riding. When they arrived at Tom Thumb, they chose a copy of The Naked Gun. After spending a short time inside the store, they eventually began the ride home. By then, night had completely fallen over the countryside. As the boys rode away from Tom Thumb, the familiar lights of town slowly faded behind them until they disappeared entirely. Ahead of them stretched empty rural roads with no streetlights, no nearby houses, and almost no traffic. The only real source of light was the flashlight Jacob carried with him. They were only about 2 or 3 minutes away from the Wetterling home, riding near a long gravel road, when a man suddenly stepped out of the darkness and moved towards them. He was dressed entirely in black and wore a black mask covering his face. He told the boys he had a gun and ordered all three of them to stop. The man instructed them to push their bicycles into the ditch before ordering the boys to lie face down on the ground. At first, the three boys struggled to understand how serious the situation really was. Part of them wondered if this might somehow be a prank being carried out by older teenagers from the area. But that illusion quickly disappeared once the man began speaking to them. His voice was cold, rough, and emotionless. He approached Trevor first and asked how old he was. Trevor answered that he was 10 years old. The man then ordered him to get up and run into the woods as fast as he could. He warned Trevor not to look back, threatening to shoot him if he did. After Trevor disappeared into the darkness, the man turned his attention toward Jacob and Aaron, ordering both boys to stand up. As he held them there, he touched Jacob while continuing to question them. He asked Aaron how old he was, and Aaron answered that he was 11. The man then asked Jacob the same question, and Jacob also replied that he was 11 years old. Moments later, the man gave Aaron the same command he had given Trevor. Aaron ran into the darkness so fast that he eventually caught up with Trevor further down the road. Once the two boys were together again, the urge to look back became overwhelming. When they finally turned around, both Jacob and the masked man were gone. There were no sounds of a struggle, no vehicle driving away, no indication of where either of them had gone. It was approximately 9:20 p.m., the last time Jacob Wetterling was ever seen alive. Terrified, Trevor and Aaron immediately ran back toward the Wetterling home screaming for help. Their panic alerted Rochelle that something terrible had happened. The boys shouted that someone had taken Jacob, that he was gone. Shocked and unsure how to handle the situation, Rochelle ran next door to get her father, Mel Druzak. Mel immediately understood the seriousness of what he was hearing and quickly called Patty and Jerry at the dinner party they were attending. He told them they needed to come home immediately. Although the details were still unclear, Jacob appeared to have been abducted by a stranger. After hanging up with the Wetterlings, Mel called 911. Because he had not witnessed the abduction himself, he struggled to explain the details to the dispatcher and eventually handed the phone to Trevor so the frightened 10-year-old boy could describe what had happened himself.
Hello, Trevor? You're talking to the sheriff's office, okay? I want you to give me anything you can recall about this male party that approached you guys, okay?
Well, he was like, he was like a man, sort of big.
What? You're large?
Little.
Okay.
Yeah, the just kind of like nylon things as a mask.
Do you know what color it was?
Black.
A black mask? Do you know what color jacket he had on?
It's black too.
Later, Trevor described the man as having a deep, raspy voice that sounded calm and controlled. The frantic 911 call captured the chaos unfolding inside the Wetterling home as the boys and nearby adults struggled to explain what had happened. Jacob had been wearing a red jacket with metal buttons and a sheriff's department patch, along with reflective clothing, and he had been carrying a flashlight. The dispatcher repeatedly asked whether the boys had seen a vehicle nearby, but Trevor and Aaron could only say that the masked man had appeared on foot in the middle of the road. When the first officers arrived at the Wetterling home, the investigation immediately suffered from a critical error in judgment. Instead of launching an immediate search for the abductor, officers spent some of the most important early moments of the case aggressively questioning Trevor and Aaron with deep skepticism. At first, investigators did not fully believe the boys' account of the abduction. Some officers reportedly considered theories that the boys may have accidentally shot Jacob while playing with a gun, or that Jacob had simply run away and his friends were inventing a story to protect themselves. It was not until approximately 10:45 p.m., nearly 90 minutes after the abduction, that a formal search operation was finally launched. By that point, the chances of locating the kidnapper somewhere near the scene had already narrowed dramatically. Law enforcement eventually mobilized a massive search effort involving firefighters, volunteers, helicopters, and officers from multiple agencies. But despite the scale of the operation, investigators recovered only 2 physical clues near the gravel road, a set of footprints and tire tracks. One detail would later become heavily criticized in the years that followed. Amid the confusion and urgency of that night, officers failed to immediately canvass nearby homes and neighbors for information that could potentially have been critical during the earliest hours of the investigation. By the following morning, news of Jacob's abduction had spread throughout St. Joseph, and the small town rapidly transformed as residents mobilized to help search for the missing 11-year-old boy. Media coverage quickly intensified, turning Jacob Wetterling's disappearance into a story followed across the United States. The Wetterling home became the center of nonstop activity, as hundreds of officers from multiple jurisdictions, including the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, flooded into the area. During the week following Jacob's disappearance, the search effort grew to an enormous scale. Thousands of volunteers formed human chains stretching across open fields and rural roads, while officers deployed tracking dogs, helicopters, and off-road vehicles to search the surrounding countryside. Some investigators even searched on horseback. But despite the massive mobilization and thousands of hours spent searching, no trace of Jacob was ever found. Patty and Jerry Wetterling became determined to keep Jacob's name in the public eye, giving media interviews almost every single day. In an interview with the St. Cloud Times, Jerry spoke with overwhelming guilt and regret. "I'll carry this burden for the rest of my life. I was the one who made the decision that night, and my son never came home. If anyone has any information about Jacob, please come forward. I would give up anything, pay any price, just to bring my son home." The family hoped that keeping Jacob constantly in the news would eventually generate the lead needed to bring him back. But as the investigation slowly began to stall, Patty Wetterling refused to let her son be remembered only as another missing child. Just months after the abduction, Patty and Jerry founded an organization called the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, focused on child safety education and support for families of missing children. Through her work with investigators and child protection organizations across the United States, Patty gradually realized there was a much larger problem within the American legal system at the time. In the early 1990s, the United States still had no federal requirement for sex offender registration. Individuals convicted of crimes against children could move from one state to another with little ability for local law enforcement agencies to effectively track or share information about them. Patty began testifying before Congress, meeting with lawmakers and publicly advocating for the creation of a nationwide sex offender registry system. She repeatedly argued that communities could not properly protect children if law enforcement did not know where dangerous offenders were living. Those efforts eventually led to the passage of the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act in 1994. The law required all 50 states to establish sex offender registration systems and share information with law enforcement agencies. It would later become the foundation for Megan's Law in 1996, and years later, the Adam Walsh Act, marking a major shift in American legal priorities from protecting offender privacy toward emphasizing public safety and the monitoring of repeat offenders. Even so, Jacob was still missing. Over the years, investigators collected nearly 70,000 leads, each one documented and followed up by detectives. Every year on Jacob's birthday, Patty and Jerry carried out a painful ritual. They would light a single candle on a cupcake in honor of their son, holding on to the hope that one day Jacob would return home to blow it out himself. They also kept the porch light on every single night, a silent signal meant to tell Jacob that the way home would always remain open for him. The case remained quiet until 1997, when Patty Wetterling reunited with an old friend named Evangeline during an annual prayer service held for Jacob. During their conversation afterward, Evangeline mentioned something that immediately shocked Patty. Before being transferred to St. Joseph, an associate priest named Damian Burke had reportedly served at another parish in Little Falls and had been quietly connected to allegations of misconduct involving a teenage boy. According to Evangeline, the matter had disappeared without any public explanation, and Damian had simply been transferred to another church. Patty soon discovered that Damian Burke had arrived in St. Joseph only months before Jacob disappeared. When Jerry brought this information to investigators, he was told there was not enough evidence to justify formally investigating a member of the church based solely on rumors. In the late 1990s, the Catholic Church still carried enormous social influence in many small Minnesota communities, and publicly suspecting a priest was viewed by some people as almost unthinkable. But Jerry refused to let the lead go. He began speaking with neighbors and local residents, eventually gathering more than 1,000 signatures demanding authorities investigate whether Damian could be connected to Jacob's disappearance. Under growing public pressure, the Stearns County Sheriff's Office eventually opened a formal investigation. Damian Burke agreed to be interviewed and later submitted to a polygraph examination, but the results reportedly showed signs of deception. Trevor Wetterling was also played recordings of Damian's voice and said it sounded very similar to the masked man who had stopped the three boys on the gravel road years earlier. Still, investigators found no direct physical evidence linking the priest to Jacob's disappearance. The investigation quickly divided the St. Joseph community. While some residents believed the Wetterling family had every right to pursue any possible lead, others viewed the public suspicion surrounding a Catholic priest as deeply offensive to the church. Patty and Jerry faced isolation and intense backlash from parts of the local community. In the end, like so many other leads in the Wetterling investigation, the suspicion surrounding Damian Burke slowly collapsed into another dead end. There was no confession, no forensic evidence, and after years of controversy, the question of whether the priest had any involvement in Jacob's disappearance remained unanswered. The direction of the investigation changed dramatically in 2004 when John Sanner was elected sheriff of Stearns County. Unlike many officials before him, Sanner publicly promised that his department would use every available resource to solve the Wetterling case. Sanner and his team began re-examining the evidence from the ground up, eventually abandoning one of the core assumptions that had shaped the investigation for nearly 14 years: the belief that the abductor had used a vehicle. Instead, investigators developed a new theory: that the abduction had been carried out on foot. That shift was significant because it suggested the offender may have lived extremely close to the gravel road where Jacob disappeared. And as the investigation narrowed, attention became heavily focused on one man, Dan Ressier. Dan Ressier was an elementary school music teacher who lived at the end of the same gravel road where the abduction had taken place in 1989. On the night Jacob disappeared around 9 p.m., Dan had been home alone when he heard his dog, Smirky, barking outside. Looking through the window, he noticed headlights moving down his driveway. The vehicle eventually turned around and drove away, something Dan dismissed before returning to bed. A short time later, Smirky began barking again. This time when Dan looked outside, he saw several men carrying flashlights near his woodpile. Believing someone might be attempting to steal firewood, he initially prepared to confront them, but after seeing how many people were outside, he decided to remain inside and call 911 instead. The dispatcher informed him that the men were police officers searching for a missing child. Dan then walked outside and offered to help, suggesting nearby farm structures and rural properties that investigators might want to search. But despite speaking directly with officers that night, no one formally interviewed him about the headlights he had seen earlier in the evening. So why, 15 years later, had investigators suddenly become so interested in Dan Ressier? The answer came from a delayed witness statement given by a man named Kevin. On the night of Jacob's abduction in 1989, Kevin and his girlfriend had been listening to a police scanner when they overheard the first reports about a missing boy in St. Joseph. Curious about the unfolding situation, they drove toward the area to see what was happening for themselves. They eventually turned onto the gravel road, where they turned their vehicle around and noticed the boys' bicycles lying in the ditch. For a moment, they considered picking the bicycles up, but ultimately decided against it and drove away. As they were leaving the area, they encountered a police officer in a nearby parking lot and attempted to report what they had seen. According to Kevin, the officer dismissed the information and showed little interest. Over the years, Kevin casually retold the story at parties as an awkward conversation starter, until 2003, when he happened to tell it to someone who turned out to be a federal law enforcement officer. That officer urged Kevin to finally provide a formal statement to investigators. For Sheriff Sanner's team, Kevin's story offered a convenient explanation for both the vehicle Dan Ressier had seen in his driveway that night and the tire tracks discovered near the scene. In the minds of investigators, it effectively removed the vehicle theory from the abduction itself. And suddenly, after 15 years, investigators believed they had a clear suspect in the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling. Over the next several years, detectives focused enormous resources on building a case against Dan Ressier. The investigation reached its peak on June 30th, 2010, when a massive task force made up of the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, FBI agents, and state investigators arrived at Ressier's property to carry out an aggressive search operation. The search lasted 2 full days and quickly became a major media spectacle. News helicopters circled overhead as television crews broadcast images of investigators digging through a specific area behind the property where Dan and his family had regularly dumped ashes from their wood stove. The public nature of the search devastated Dan Ressier's life. His face was broadcast across the country as the primary suspect in the Wetterling abduction, and for years afterward, he lived under a cloud of suspicion and hostility. An elementary school music teacher who still lived with his elderly parents, Dan consistently maintained his innocence throughout the investigation. Although he repeatedly complained about the treatment he received and the emotional damage caused by the case, the pressure never truly eased. He continued cooperating with authorities whenever requested. Yet despite that cooperation, he remained the central focus of the investigation. For years, the Wetterling investigation stayed locked onto Dan Rasier. And it only truly began to shift when someone from the past resurfaced. That person was Jared Shirel, now an adult. After moving to the town of Painesville, Jared began hearing about a series of sexual attacks that had occurred in the area years earlier. Slowly, he started connecting the events in his own mind. He began to suspect that his own abduction, Jacob's disappearance, and the crimes in Painesville had all been committed by the same man. Working alongside blogger Joy Baker, Jared helped reconnect investigators with other victims from the Painesville attacks and pushed authorities assigned to the Wetterling case to reopen those earlier investigations in 2013. That renewed interest led investigators to revisit physical evidence that had been preserved for decades. Most importantly, law enforcement still possessed the clothing Jared had been wearing on the night of his abduction in 1989, along with a hair sample collected from a suspect years earlier. Advances in forensic science finally made a DNA comparison possible, something investigators simply could not do 27 years earlier. The results revealed that DNA recovered from Jared's sweatshirt matched the hair sample collected years earlier from Danny Heinrich. After nearly 3 decades, investigators finally had direct forensic evidence linking Heinrich to the abduction and attack on Jared Shirel. By that point, Heinrich was a 53-year-old unmarried man living quietly in Annandale, Minnesota. For years, he had attracted little public attention, his name buried among hundreds of tips and potential suspects generated during the earliest stages of the investigation. In fact, Heinrich had been one of the very first suspects questioned during the original 1989 investigation. He had been released at the time, but decades later, DNA evidence finally provided the link law enforcement had failed to uncover years earlier, connecting him directly to the attack on Jared Shirel. During the original 1989 investigation into Jacob Wetterling's disappearance, detectives had already looked into Danny Heinrich because of similarities between multiple cases in the area. Heinrich cooperated with investigators at the time, providing hair samples, shoes, and even allowing officers to examine the tires on his vehicle. Although investigators noticed that both his shoes and tire treads shared several similarities with evidence recovered near the Wetterling crime scene, they ultimately concluded that the evidence was still not strong enough to directly identify him as the abductor. Detectives continued monitoring Heinrich for weeks before eventually obtaining a warrant to search his father's home, where Heinrich was living at the time. During the search, investigators discovered several troubling items, including black boots, a pair of hammer pants, and a police scanner, the same type of device Jared Shirel had described hearing during his abduction months earlier. Officers also discovered several locked trunks. Inside were photographs involving unidentified boys, significantly increasing investigators' concerns about Heinrich. Heinrich insisted that the photographs were harmless and not what they appeared to be. In a decision that would later face heavy criticism, investigators allowed him to keep the photographs, which Heinrich later destroyed by burning them. Because detectives believed they still lacked enough evidence to formally charge him at the time, Heinrich was ultimately released. Years later, that decision would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire Wetterling investigation. Investigators had already been looking at a man who lived near the area, possessed a police scanner matching Jared Shirel's description, and owned shoes and tires similar to evidence found near the crime scene. They had even discovered disturbing photographs involving unidentified boys during the search of his home. Yet in 1989, most of those details were still viewed as suspicious circumstances rather than direct courtroom evidence. There was no DNA, no confession, and no witness capable of positively identifying Heinrich as the masked man who abducted Jacob that night. At a time when forensic technology remained limited, and with enormous pressure to build a case strong enough to prosecute a child abduction that had shocked the entire state, investigators ultimately decided they did not yet have sufficient legal grounds to charge him. Only decades later would the magnitude of that missed opportunity become fully clear. But even after DNA finally linked Heinrich to the 1989 attack on Jared Shirel, another major legal obstacle immediately emerged. The statute of limitations for that specific crime had already expired years earlier. That meant the state could no longer prosecute Heinrich for Jared's abduction and assault, despite the direct DNA evidence connecting him to the crime. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, many American states still imposed time limits on prosecuting even severe crimes involving children. Those laws were built around the assumption that physical evidence and witness testimony would gradually become less reliable over time. Years later, however, advances in DNA technology began solving cold cases that once seemed impossible to crack. As a result, many states eventually expanded or eliminated statutes of limitations for violent crimes against children. But in most cases, those legal changes could not be applied retroactively to crimes where the statute of limitations had already expired before the new laws took effect. Although this became a major source of frustration for both investigators and the victims' families, the DNA results still provided law enforcement with the legal basis needed to obtain a new search warrant for Heinrich's current residence. On July 28, 2015, investigators carried out a search of Heinrich's home. Inside a kitchen drawer, they found duct tape and handcuffs. They also discovered 4 large bins filled with children's clothing. Perhaps most disturbing were the numerous VHS tapes Heinrich had recorded over the course of more than a decade. The tapes contained footage he had filmed of young boys. Investigators also recovered 19 binders containing sensitive material involving children. Based on the evidence discovered inside the home, Heinrich was arrested and charged with multiple offenses involving child sexual abuse material. Heinrich spent nearly a year in jail awaiting trial. Then, just 3 weeks before the proceedings were scheduled to begin, his legal team proposed a plea agreement that would finally give the Wetterling family the answers they had been searching for over the previous 27 years. Under the terms of the agreement, Heinrich would provide a full confession to the abduction and murder of Jacob Wetterling, and lead investigators to the location of the boy's remains. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to charge him with murder. Instead, Heinrich would plead guilty to charges connected to the illegal exploitative material discovered inside his home, carrying a maximum sentence of roughly 17 to 20 years in federal prison. For Patty and Jerry Wetterling, bringing their son home and finally learning the truth about what had happened to him mattered more than pursuing a longer sentence. And so they accepted the agreement. Heinrich's confession was cold, methodical, and devastating. It finally destroyed the fragile hope the Wetterling family had carried for nearly 3 decades. He admitted that on the night of October 22, 1989, he had been driving around the St. Joseph area looking for a victim. At some point, he turned onto the dead-end road leading toward the Wetterling home and noticed 3 boys riding their bicycles into town. Heinrich parked near the gravel road and waited for them to return. Just as Trevor and Aaron had described for years, he stopped the boys on their way home, forced them into the ditch, and ultimately selected Jacob. He handcuffed the 11-year-old boy and placed him into the front passenger seat of his vehicle. As Heinrich drove away, Jacob cried uncontrollably, repeatedly asking what he had done wrong. Heinrich had a police scanner inside the vehicle, and as radio traffic began increasing across local law enforcement channels, he realized the search for the missing boy had already begun. He ordered Jacob to stay low in the passenger seat, so passing patrol officers would not see him. Heinrich then spent some time driving around the roads near St. Joseph before eventually heading back toward Paynesville, the town where he lived. At some point, he pulled onto a remote side road near a gravel pit and ordered Jacob out of the vehicle. In the isolation of the gravel pit, Heinrich attacked the boy. Afterwards, Jacob began crying again, shivering in the cold night air and saying that he was cold and wanted to go home. As Jacob was getting dressed, a patrol car happened to drive past the area. Although the officers were not specifically searching that road at the time, the sight of police lights caused Heinrich to panic. He became convinced law enforcement was closing in on him. Heinrich ordered Jacob to turn around and then attempted to shoot him. The gun jammed on the first attempt, but moments later, Heinrich cleared the weapon and fired again. Jacob collapsed to the ground. Heinrich initially left the boy's body behind and drove home, but several hours later, he returned carrying a shovel. After realizing he could not dig a grave deep enough by hand, He went to a nearby construction site and stole a bobcat loader. Using the heavy machinery, Heinrich dug a grave, buried Jacob, and later returned the bobcat to the construction site. He attempted to conceal the burial site with grass and dirt before leaving the area. Shortly afterward, he realized he had forgotten to bury Jacob's shoes, so he returned, collected them, and threw them into a nearby ravine. Approximately 1 year later, Heinrich returned to the burial site once again and decided to move the remains. He transported them to a nearby pasture and buried them in a shallow grave, roughly 2 feet deep. When Danny Heinrich finally led investigators to the location 27 years later, the metal detectors they had prepared to use became unnecessary. Investigators had originally intended to search for the metal buttons from Jacob's red jacket. Instead, they discovered a small, faded piece of red fabric sticking out of the ground. It had remained there for decades, partially exposed to the harsh Minnesota seasons, while the world moved on and the search for Jacob continued elsewhere. The recovery of Jacob's remains systematically destroyed the fragile hope Patty and Jerry Wetterling had carried for 10,000 days. Every February 17th, the family had lit a single birthday candle for Jacob, holding on to the possibility that one day he might still come home. That ritual finally came to an end. The porch light that had remained on every night as a beacon for their missing son was finally turned off, replaced by the unbearable reality of what had happened to him. The family was forced to reconcile the gentle 11-year-old boy they remembered with the knowledge that Jacob's final words had been a frightened question, asking what he had done wrong. The legal resolution of the case brought its own bitterness. Because of expired statutes of limitations and the structure of the plea agreement, Heinrich was never convicted of Jacob's murder. Instead, his sentence became tied to the illegal exploitative material investigators had recovered from his home. On November 21, 2016, Heinrich received a 20-year federal prison sentence at USP Leavenworth in Kansas, the maximum sentence available, followed by lifetime supervised release after imprisonment. With credit for time already served after his 2015 arrest, Heinrich could potentially be released around the year 2035, at approximately 73 years old, after destroying the childhoods of Jacob and multiple other victims. Even so, Patty Wetterling publicly chose forgiveness during court proceedings, later explaining that it helps me sleep better at night, while continuing her advocacy for stronger child protection laws. In an interview following Jacob's funeral, Patty Wetterling spoke through tears. "My little boy is finally home," she said. "I'm deeply grateful for the dedication and persistence of the law enforcement officers who never gave up on Jacob." She also took a moment to acknowledge the painful consequences the investigation had inflicted on others over the years, expressing sympathy for the individuals who had publicly fallen under suspicion and whose reputations had been permanently damaged during the decades-long search for answers. The conclusion of the Wetterling case did not simply close an investigation. It permanently changed the meaning of childhood safety in America. Yet for the people of St. Joseph, the lasting legacy was the permanent loss of the sense of security that once allowed children to ride their bicycles home after dark without fear. Perhaps the most painful part for parents like Patty and Jerry Wetterling was not simply living for years without knowing who had killed their son, but ultimately having to accept a legal agreement with his killer in exchange for learning where their child had been buried.
Okay.
My whole name is Jacob Wetterling. My favorite food is steak. My favorite color is blue. My best friend is Aaron Larson. My favorite thing to do most is watch football. What I want to be when I grow up is a football player.
What do you think was the biggest mistake made during the entire investigation? And do you believe modern legal systems today are truly capable of preventing cases like this from happening again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, take care of the people you love.